Sam. Not many people know who you are. I stumbled across your page from Angus Bradley, and we've had some discussions in the past. I reached out to you in just over Instagram, and we had a good chat about some biomechanics. I wanted to pick your brain in regards to punching power. I think just before we get started, I would like you to just probably just introduce yourself to the audience, what you do, what your background is, and kind of what you specialize in.
Yeah, so thanks for having me on. I'm a fifth year biomedical engineering PhD candidate here in Stevens Institute of Technology in New Jersey. And I research mostly sports biomechanics. So in terms of like, I'm 55 years in, this is the final year looking to get jobs and then wrapping up my research. And pretty much my research is split into a half and half of basketball movement biomechanics and baseball pitching biomechanics. And some, I mean, the reality is one of the baseball pitching project was offered to me because the data was collected and the way the professor taught us to analyze movement from a fundamental physics perspective that doesn't really change from sport to sport. The laws of physics that dictates, how and why you move and how you are able to move that way, that remains constant. So I started off with the baseball pitching project and then moved on to the basketball running jumps project. Both goals are quite simple and parallel in the sense that number one, the goal is to understand how the movements are being executed from a very fundamental point of view. And number two is like behind performance that you could measure. So I'll talk a bit more about it where we view things in the momentum domain, right? Behind that
Yeah,
momentum quantified performance variables, how is that done? From a very fundamental physics perspective. So that's the general research approach. And in terms of my own sporting background, I actually did quite a lot of martial arts training
cool.
when I was back in China
Yeah,
and dabbled in. That was the most I've done alongside Taekwondo. I really don't like the way Taekwondo is taught. I enjoy kicking, but I do not
mhm,
enjoy just doing the sequences of movements on its own. I found it very tedious. And the
yeah.
Chinese martial arts, I actually learned how to like handle a few weapons. So
Wow.
some of the ones was pretty fun. Like there was one that's a nunchuck, but then they have an unequal length. So you have like a super long on one end, and then there's a attachment on the very tail end of it. That was pretty fun. And
Yeah.
what's funny was I remember this is a funny anecdote. The coach, the master, so that in that dojo environment, one of the weapons was a bench that you sit on. Again, there's a whole sequence of movements that you can swing around the bench, and then that's like part of the. That's why martial arts, some part of it is performance, and then that was some exposure to martial arts.
Yeah.
But my main sport was basketball through and through,
Yeah.
and in some places where physical basketball was played, it might turn into a little bit of martial arts with a few elbows being thrown, but
Of course.
yeah, but
It
mainly it was basketball, and I played that all throughout university. So.
Wow. So growing up in school, I played basketball a lot. That was my favorite
Hmm.
sport. That was my main
Yeah.
sport in school. And yeah, I could actually move back then and jump really well as a shooting guard. And it does
Hmm.
get quite physical. Like there was
Yep.
a lot of close encounters. Change of direction is huge, as you can see. But yeah, just dabbling into going back when you say you view things from a momentum perspective.
Hmm.
Can you elaborate a little bit more on that?
Yeah. So this actually ties in with my motivation coming into the PhD, where I played basketball, wanted to dunk, as with most basketball players, and then that was also the same time where research into, or not really research, but discussions into optimal technique comes about. So I sort of came into the PhD with the goal to understand, what is the optimal technique behind, two for running jumps and basketball. What are some best ways to jump higher? But as I got there and I started to dabble more into my professor's philosophy. So my professor is Antonia Zafariu, and she studies dancing turns and rotations and balance for her PhD. And she studied it under Jill McNitt Gray at USC, so University of South California.
Mm-hmm.
who did a lot of stuff with sprinters, track and field, gymnastics, where there's very defined objectives for the movement. Like each the movement state, it's been described as being well practiced. That one's quite self-explanatory, but also goal-directed, meaning there's a very specific goal behind the movement that you accomplish, and you can work backwards from that goal to understand how it's being done. And the how part, that's deeply rooted in the fundamental mechanics, meaning Newtonian mechanics that determines how, like, the motion of your body is driven by how you interact with your environment.
Right. I
So,
remember we spoke about this, and it was
yep,
very interesting. So essentially, let's just create a picture here, right? Let's say the movement objective is to throw a rear hand punch. Let's call it a right cross. We would look at that. Okay, so the goal here is to throw this right hand as hard and as fast as possible into the opponent's skull. And we're going to work back from the point of contact, and we're going to look at the joint actions that take place in order to execute this movement, and then the forces that that have to be applied in order to execute the task. Is that correct?
yes, if you want to approach it from there, you can say something as like, it's actually quite similar to how baseball pitching
Yes.
should be analyzed, right? Where it's a end point distal segment that needs to be accelerated, within a certain time frame. I assume for punching, the constraint of time is probably more important than it is a pitch, right? The pitch duration can be long or short, where the trajectory of the ball was the goal. But for a punch, yes, you want to accelerate your fist fast enough, but you don't want to take forever to do it.
Mhm.
And you can work backwards from there, where to accelerate some segment of your body, you also need to accelerate the whole of your body to some extent. And you also want to generate rotations in the body to some extent, right? And the thing is, skilled movers, just through repetitions alone, can generally figure out, what are some ways that works the best for them to deliver the result of the punch. But generally, you want some sort of forward acceleration on your body through pushing against the ground. And also those same directions of forces from each leg against the ground also create some rotation of the body that you then leverage and accelerate your hand. So that's the sort of the framework you can think about punching as.
So interesting. So the athlete, when we talk about the athlete creating a linear force, linear before rotation or before angular forces or angular momentum, when we're talking about rotational based sports, obviously rotation's taking place within the
Mm-hmm.
joints all the time.
Yes.
Um,
Yes.
can you elaborate a little bit more, just say, for example, because you wrote that paper on pitching,
Mm-hmm.
um, can you talk a little bit more about the transition from linear to angular momentum?
Yes. So I first want to sort of say that it doesn't necessarily have to happen sequentially,
Mm-hmm.
because the laws of physics that governs the movements there's no requirements that you need to generate linear motion before rotational movements, but sometimes it is convenient. Okay, so it's the way we can describe it as being beneficial but not necessary.
But why
So
why
in the
why is it convenient though? Like,
yeah, so
can
okay, why is it convenient? In the case of baseball pitching, it's because of the very specific setup where you start off on the back leg, and you have then contact with the front leg and then the pitch. So the best strategy is to make sure that you have some forward momentum, and then when you break with your front leg aggressively, you can convert a lot of the momentum into rotations, right? But that was the general perception of baseball pitching, how rotations are generated. But what I was sort of quantifying with my first paper was that a lot of the setup for rotation has already occurred. And that's the difference between what people perceive as rotations, like the rotation of your body segments, your trunk rotating in the transverse plane and your pelvis rotating in the transverse plane, and also bending and flexing in the other planes. All of that accounts for rotation, especially that at the whole body level. So in biomechanics, that is quantified as angular momentum, or really the summation of every ounce of rotation in your body. So you have, as your legs move through space, it's going to have some amount of rotational momentum, angular momentum. As your trunk flexes, for example, in the frontal plane, you also create a lot of rotations, okay? So in baseball pitching, the back leg contact accelerates your body forward, and that also allows you to generate a lot of rotation at the whole body level, but that's quite slow. You couldn't quite see it yet. You only see the fast amount of rotations that comes from the back leg's ground contact once the front leg contacts the ground, right? All of the sort of momentum you have generated is now being used to accelerate the trunk, to accelerate the arm. And so that's for there. I cannot explain why that in pitching one occurs in the other, but what I have to say is it doesn't necessarily have to be in that sequence. For example, if taking my professor's research, dancers, when they perform a series of turns, right? You've seen videos of ballet dancers that maintains balance while performing really high velocity rotations. And my professor's question was, how are they doing that? If you look at the movement, what's happening with the dancers, there's simultaneous translation, meaning their body moves across space, and rotation at the same time, right? There is no sequence of, oh, I need to translate before I rotate, because the task itself demands you do both at the same time. So one thing I wanted to say is, depending on the movement, sometimes there's specific phases that require you to do one thing before the other. In pitching, what ends up happening was that people accelerate before they generate a lot of momentum, rotational momentum. But in dancing, right, it can be simultaneous. So I just want to say it doesn't necessarily have to be that. In punching, it may as well follow quite a lot like pitching, but the forward momentum of the whole body might not be as high, right? Because you don't want to stuff your face all the way into your opponents before you throw the punch.
Yeah.
So I think punching might actually be closer to dancing in that regard, where you have some amount of translation being generated, but you want to get rotation quite quick.
Yeah, you made a great point. It's specific to the task and the actual, like, it all goes back to what the task is that you're trying to achieve. And like, if you look at punching, not every punch is the same. You have a jab, you have a left hook, you have an uppercut, you have, a rear hand punch is probably going to be the most specific towards someone throwing a ball. And like what you said, there is some linear, like, I feel like you have to push into the ground to move your body forward slightly and create that rotation, depending on, obviously, if we're not looking at the tactical element, but we're looking at someone who's just throwing a rear hand punch as hard as they can into a bag or into a pad with their boxing coach, you're going to see some of these representations, like you just said, where they will have to push and move forward, similar to throwing a ball. But obviously not to that extent where they're falling over their front leg. So
I actually want to touch on one thing. It actually sounds more like batting a ball, the opposite side of the baseball sport, because there's in batting research, there's been like some work that's done looking at how rotation is generated, where, right, you have a stationary start and then you want to accelerate a implement that's more distal to your body to high speeds, where there's also less forward translation, and time is actually also a constraint. And in that case, the story from the actions of each leg is actually quite clear, because the direction of forces from each leg, they point in opposite directions, but they don't point exactly at each other. They point at an off angle. So if you only look at linear movements, the forward translation isn't that much, because the forces going opposite direction, they cancel out. Right. But when you have forces that go in opposite directions but at an angle, it creates a lot of rotation. It almost creates purely rotation. So I'd assume in punching, you also have that each leg, like for example, back leg is driving you forward, front leg is pushing you back, but there's some offset in the angle that creates rotation in your whole body, right? That manifests first in the trunk, and then you have your sequences of movements where, your trunk can accelerate first, but then pull back a bit, and then your arm segment continues to accelerate forward. That's totally likely. That's totally possible thing that's going on, where you don't need to jump forward, right? You don't need that much
No.
forward propulsion. The forward force is to ensure that you can generate rotation, which is probably more closely tied to the objective of the task.
And I think this is important to know. I find it really interesting, to really look at the kinematics of the sport and look at the movement tasks and, really get into the nitty gritty. I personally enjoy it. I still don't know enough about it, which is why I've got you on. And I find it really
I also
interesting.
don't know too much about it, but I can help you get
Yeah,
closer. That's
that
all biomechanics can hope to do.
definitely. I just think it'll lead to better reasoning behind your prescription. If your
Mm-hmm.
goal is to improve, obviously, physical qualities for the sport, there's certain, obviously, loopholes in there for the reasoning behind our prescription. Now, I guess I wanted to talk more about, obviously, force plates with you. I put
Mm-hmm.
up a story the other day of an athlete, looked like he was cheating the test. He basically was doing a weighted CMJ jump, and at
Mm-hmm.
the top of the jump, he pretty much almost tried to bring his knees towards his face, and flexed his whole body, and that would probably give you, an off reading of height. Would say that he probably jumped higher than what he really did. Um, so I wanted to talk to you about how important it is to look at the differences between the way athletes produce force to what's spat out on a screen.
Yeah.
Um, and
So yeah. So I first want to touch on a bit how force plates. So there are many ways to get a jump height from force plate readings. And some might say it's not purely necessary that you to use force plates themselves. And the reason is your jump height is as simple as a projectile motion equation or something you learn in physics class, right? You launch something out of a cannon, and then you see how far it goes, how long it takes, how much time it spends in the air. Gravitational constant at ground level, you pretty much it's exactly the same. So everything is very deterministic. If you have a set of variables, you can very accurately compute the other ones. So the limitations really comes from the practical aspect. So the easiest way that jump height is calculated is with jump height. With flight
go,
time.
yeah,
Flight time. So a jump mat that's a lot cheaper than force plates. That's what they rely on, where it's taking the time between the takeoff and the landing, where the jump mat senses pressure. It doesn't quite know how much pressure there is, but it knows sort of when pressure exceeds a certain threshold. And that's how they're able to use the time to compute the jump height. So it's actually less so what matters about how high the person gets in the air and what position they're at in the air. So you can do a backflip. You can bring your knees to your chest. It doesn't actually matter for jump height computations using flight time if your landing posture is consistent. Because think about it, if you take off, when you take off, people generally take off fully extended, right? The classic triple extension posture that we know and love. But then when you land, how you land obviously changes your time. If you land more straight on, you land earlier. If you land with your knees bent, you land a bit later. Some knee bend is going to happen naturally just because it cushions impact. But it's actually not what matters at the apex of the jump. It's how you interact with the ground at the moment of touchdown that matters if the method of computation for jump height is flight time. But if you use other methods that doesn't rely on flight time, because flight time relies on the instant of takeoff and landing, if you use other methods, it actually is immune to whatever shenanigans you do in the air. So that's one huge value for force plates. So when you perform a counter movement jump, all of the phases in the study that's been defined have you starting from standing stationary, right? That's where it's the stationary, and then you go down and then you go up. And then the force plate is able to sense the instant of you being stationary and you going down and up. And then you can use how much impulse, meaning force applied over time. It uses that to get your center of mass velocity at takeoff because of everything is governed by the same set of equations. once it has the center mass velocity at takeoff, that is the jump height. It doesn't matter how you
Yeah.
land.
Yeah.
So in that case, it's
is that
actually
the
immune.
so it's the eccentric and concentric impulse that they're looking at. And obviously, if you have a higher, let's say, call it time to peak velocity, they're essentially going to jump higher if they have a more, let's say, a quicker time to peak velocity. Would that directly affect their jump height?
So the one thing that 100% is like directly leads to jump height. Like it's not like a one-to-one line, because it's the relationship between velocity and impulse and height is like a squared relationship, but it's pretty much like if you run this for correlation, it's very close to being perfect. That is the concentric impulse, because that describes every ounce of impulse you spent while your center mass is either at zero velocity or already moving up.
Yeah.
So that's all of the I don't want to use work, because work has a specific meaning, but that's like how much work, quote unquote, you've done to accelerate your center mass upwards.
Okay, so
Concentric impulse is the directly related to jump height. So once you have that, and you have the center mass velocity at takeoff, that's jump height. That literally is it.
I just think it's such a useful tool for rehab, because there's certain things like, let's say, for example, someone dips a little bit longer, or they have a longer eccentric impulse. And then as they're transitioning into the concentric phase, they probably won't want to really drive the knee forward, or the braking forces from the transition from eccentric to concentric. You would probably see a breakdown, and you would see a longer time to produce the force if someone was coming back from a lower limb injury. In terms of performance, do you use force plates a lot in your, like, just with yourself or with your athletes? Are you using them regularly, or do you see a lot of value and merit in having data like that, in terms of yeah.
So I will say this: I don't really use them for assessments, because the force plates for me, they are a way to capture what's happening during the movement. So it's not like I'm using counter movement jump as an assessment. What I do usually is I have the athletes perform the movements of interest that I want to study, for example, a running jump. And one big difference actually between the movements that, like counter movement jump, the kind of force plates you use, they only capture forces in the vertical directions. Okay. So it's very useful if the task mostly occurs along the vertical axis, aka jumping straight up and down. It gives you a lot of insights. It's really good in that way. But what differs between those force plates and the ones you see in biomechanics lab, those ones that are attached, like installed into the ground, is that the ones that in labs, they measure forces in all three directions. They are able to measure vertical forces, as with your Hawken Dynamics force plates, but also horizontal forces. And one important thing to note is that we talked about generation of rotations, generation of forward, backward momentum. That all occurs because of horizontal forces. So the one unique and, in my opinion, overwhelming advantage of like the 3D force plates is the ability to understand how things happen in planes that goes beyond just the vertical plane. It's the directional forces. Like if you listen to a lot of sprint coaches talking about technique, right? They talk about it's the directions of the forces, the timing, and of the force application, as well as the magnitude. When you only do Hawken force sort of analytics, you're only able to capture magnitude in that specific directions, right? But you won't be able to really you can get some timing, obviously, but you lose out on the directions, where the directions of the forces are actually the most important when it comes to moving on land, when it comes to generating rotations in all of the directions.
So if you don't have access to that technology, obviously I think data is very valuable.
Yes.
Like the more and more I start to dig into it, I've just got an accelerometer now, and I was starting to play around with it and use it with just some fighters here as well. Guys that are coming back from ACL reconstructions and stuff. And I think it's such a valuable tool for rehab. But then when you say that, especially with combat sports, it's not linear. Obviously, there's a lot of side to side movement. It's all transverse, and there's a lot of rotational aspects that come into just the kinematics of the sport, especially MMA. Uh, if we don't have access to that, and you really want to look at, say that's all you had access to,
Sure.
and which most coaches do from a rehab point and performance standpoint. Let's say you just had force plates and accelerometer. Um, how valuable or how much merit does it actually hold just measuring vertical plane, let's say momentum or force? Um, how valuable is that? If like how much? What I'm trying to say is, if you can't measure the horizontal and rotational forces and you can only measure vertical, how much does vertical cover? Because if an athlete can produce force into the ground really well and push their body up in the opposite direction and be able to look at deceleration, acceleration, and the transitional phases of that, is that still just good enough if you were to like look at someone getting them back to change a direction?
Yeah, no, that's an excellent question. And so there's a few ways to address this. So number one, I would say is if you want to understand like a limb's for like an injured limb, right, compared to a healthy limb, if you want to understand the limb's ability to generate forces, over time to overcome momentum, you can do that quite easily and readily with a vertical direction only force plate. But that tells you about a general ability of the limb. And the value that 3D force plates provide is it tells you what's happening in the specific movements of interest. So if you want to know specifically exactly what's happening in a movement, be it pitching, be it running jumps, if you want to know exactly what's happening, you need the force plate. But if you want to know a general set of abilities that you can use to help guide rehabilitation, right, to guide exercise prescription, then that's enough, right? We're sort of talking about different approaches to analyzing movements with different kinds of goals. As a researcher, when I want to understand, if I am my professor's professor, my grand professor, if I want to understand how gymnasts are able to do a standing backflip and front flip, you absolutely need force plates that measures horizontal forces. But on the flip side, if I just want to analyze how well they get off the ground, right? General qualities of rate of force development, ground contact time, all of that, then you can use a tool that captures more generally what's going on. And also, you brought up a great point that, yes, most forces are in the vertical directions because gravity is going straight down. That's something, that's what you have to overcome. So, yes, if you look at the magnitude of the forces, most of them will come from the vertical direction. But that doesn't mean, I think that also emphasizes that because horizontal forces play so much into the direction of the forces, that's why they're so vital and so valuable when you want to understand specific sports movements. For general physical capabilities, you can get a lot from vertical force plates. Does that make sense?
Yeah, definitely. And that's what that's what I'm looking into now. It's just more from obviously I work a lot with rehab guys or rehab clients who are coming back from lower limb injuries, and it's just there's certain things that I'm just looking at it and I'm like, I look at just a general prescription of people using data and technology, and I just want to know why. I want to know more about the why and question a little bit more and see if there's better interventions for longer term success down the line of obviously minimizing injuries and things like that. Because just with combat sports, there's many variables to measure that come into play. The tactical element is just extremely out of my control or anything like that. And there's so many influences that come into play there. Now, I just want to move on from this. I think this was a good chat about just using force plates. I remember you put up something in regards to the power clean on
Mhm.
your YouTube, I think, and you were talking about um, I don't know the nuances within using a power clean for vertical jump height. I guess can you kind of elaborate on that a little bit more, and let's talk about the middle ground and what are some of the actual like force velocity. Let's not use force velocity, but let's say what are some of the ground contact times um, that are needed in order to kind of jump and touch a rim, for example.
Yeah. That so I'll preface this by saying, in terms of training, like the adaptations certain exercises can create, meaning, what kind of adaptations does exercises that lie on the slower end of the force velocity spectrum, what adaptations that creates versus the faster end? Those thoughts are not like not sort of my original thoughts. I sort of consume a lot of content from various coaches, combining with what I'm seeing and what I'm experiencing, right? That's generally how I process things. And also thinking it through from, a combination of physics, mechanics, biomechanics, and also, training, where the takeaway sentence is like, I align with you pick an exercise, not because of how similar it is to your sporting movements, be it peak forces, be it ground contact time. I don't think that's the way to go. You should pick it based on the kind of adaptations it creates within your body. And I'll explain why. I may not be able to say what periodization or exercise execution is the best, but what I can confidently say as a biomechanics researcher that looks at movements, especially a lot of times looking at two movements that people think is very, very similar to each other, but somehow we still find a vast array of differences between, is that two sporting movements that looks very similar can be very different. One of my main studies, movements of interest, was running jumps with and without a basketball in the hands, right? Generally, people think, oh, the only difference is you have the ball, and people say the arm swing is less. But so much more goes on. The ground contact time is being affected, each leg independently for some people. The amount of force changes across legs also varies very differently from people to people. So there's a huge amount of change that can happen within sport-specific movements. There's a lot of differences that already goes on. So think about how different things actually are between gym-based movements, which is mostly, like I mentioned before, and happening in the vertical plane, where you have some ground contact times that might be similar to a running jump, for example, but the context is very different. And then also the loads that goes on and the kinds of loads is also very different. So I don't think you should use ground contact times of specific exercises in the gym to justify translation of performance to the sports itself. But what can be certainly be beneficial is a exposure to a variety of stimulus, right? That's the strength of the gym. You're able to manipulate even the same exercises to hit different parts of the curve. And that's actually something that I don't think people talk about enough. People relegate the power clean to be in the middle of the curve. They relegate a squat to be the slow end of the curve, and plyos or sprints to be at the fast end of the curves, without acknowledging how execution, be it, you prescribe the exercise to be done a certain way, or simply how you're able to execute the movement on the day, that changes where it is on the curve,
Would
right?
you say the velocity that you move at for particular, let's say you use a light enough load that allows you to move at a particular velocity to express, that time to peak velocity. Would you say that is just, it's all relative in terms of like, you can make a squat really fast if it's light enough and you move like a bunny rabbit up and down in a box. You can also, make a power clean fast enough to the point where it may be not specific, but very similar to the force and velocity demands of a particular movement task within your sport. Let's say that, for example, let's look at a boxer. An elite level boxer has a ground contact time of anywhere between, 200 to 250 milliseconds of them pushing
In
in
what
the floor
movement?
in a rehand punch.
Okay.
All right. So if we look at a power clean and you're generating, you've got time to peak velocity and you're getting times of 250 milliseconds. Would you not think that has a dynamic correspondence to one another if the force velocity profiling of the movements are kind of interlinked, even though the movements aren't the same? Let's say the movement task is not the same. You're doing a power clean and you're throwing a punch.
Right.
There's a lot of differences and nuances there. Would you say that doesn't have some form of transfer? If you look at, is it Verkhoshansky who was talking about, Yuri's work was talking about dynamic correspondence, that there's certain 5 pillars that you need to hit in order for something
Right.
to have some form of positive transfer, whether that is, this is us getting into the specificity route where you're looking at, can you replicate the joints, the joint actions and the positions and the forces and the velocities in the weight room that you see in the sporting action? I mean, this is something I've had a good conversation with Ralph Ullman, and I can see his point of view, and I agree with it from a sprinter's perspective. But when we look at a punch and you look at combat sports and you look at the movement variability, I think it's going to be extremely hard to measure how to actually apply the gym to specifics within that movement task, because there's so much elements going on. Like, it's
Right.
you know what I mean? You have the tactical element, you have, obviously you can just train the athlete as they are, but there's just so many variables that come into play. So if you were to just look at ground contact times for a rehand punch and using a power clean that elicits the same time to peak velocity and those ground contact times, would you think that has transfer?
I'll sort of I'll describe it like this. So
Sorry, that
in
was
a
a rant.
power no. It's a complex topic, and one thing that can happen is people. I want to touch on this first before I go into details. So one thing that can certainly happen is that people do the right thing, but rationalize it with the wrong reason, right? People might say a power clean could be helpful for performance, but the why behind it's helpful, it can be totally wrong, but in the end, your performance go better, and that's how you rationalize that, right? You could use power clean to train an athlete where it might simply be the intent of the pull and the sort of what that leads to the speed of contraction in the muscles and again, time to peak velocity, but in the power clean context, right? That might have some amount of transfer, but like you said, I think it's almost a futile method. It's a futile thing to do to measure like how much correspondence there is or think through it, because you're almost never going to be able to replicate some crucial aspects. For example, if I ask you this question, how important is your decision making when it comes to throwing the punch, whether you throw it or not, and when you throw it? How important do you think that is to the success of a punch? I'll ask you this.
It's extremely important. So, like,
right? Is it more important almost than the actual execution? In some ways, right?
In some ways, but if we're looking at, like, let's say we can't control the tactical element of a fight.
Exactly.
So if the way I look at it is, like, I look at the weight room as the, like, a great explanation is hardware, and I got taught this by my mentor, Mike Fitzgerald, and I look at the skill as software, and I look at us fine-tuning the hardware within our control in the weight room. That is just working on physical qualities that support the software and the skill set. And what we look at is, I think coaches, it goes two ways. I think that when it comes to fighting, you need to understand the software as an S&C coach.
Yes.
To the point where you have a feel of the movement. You have to feel it. Now, if you look at it,
I'll quickly touch on this. You'll want to understand. It's actually a great analogy. I'm actually, the more I'm thinking about it, the more it makes sense, because when you download like if you download very specific software, there's always specifications that comes with it, right? The
that's right.
equivalent is the demand of the skill on the body, right? If a computer, if I'm downloading a video game, it says you need 16 gigabytes of RAM, and my computer can only handle 16, that means I cannot listen to music while I do it. I cannot run PowerPoints in the background while I play the video game. But if you somehow are able to make sure that your hardware easily encompasses the specificity of the software, 16 gigabyte game, 32 gigabyte computer, then it's not something you should worry about, right? And I guess I also want to say, you probably don't also want to have your hardware match specifically to be 17 gigabytes. It's probably worthwhile to just keep going up, keep
And have a
improving the
reserve.
hardware. Right. Have it where obviously you don't want to make that your only goal. But if your goal is to just constantly and consistently improve your hardware, why not just to keep improving the various qualities, right?
Yeah,
As long as you don't get lost in chasing a number, I don't think you can go too
yeah.
wrong by just generally improving.
That's the thing. How far do you push the needle until you start having negative transfer? And this
So
is
how would you know if there's negative transfer?
communication. That's it.
Right.
It's communication with your athlete. And this is where you look at a sprint coach, and a sprint coach is the hardware and the software. They coach the skill and they coach the hardware. So they're getting direct feedback of the whatever inputs they're putting into the system of the athlete. They're looking at the outputs as well. They're getting direct feedback. They're going, okay, is he getting faster? Is he getting slower? He's running in a straight line. Is he getting faster? Is he getting slower? And that feedback is there to know whether what you're doing in the weight room, is it working? And then obviously you coaching the skill, can he use what he's obviously developed in the weight room to have a positive effect on the skill set? When it comes to, like, just when I was going back, when it comes to looking at the hardware versus software, with combat sports, we don't have an open line, generally speaking, of communication with the skills-based coach. We speak two different languages. So I think when you're working in the combat sports field with athletes, you need to feel the demands, and you have to feel it, because you need to know what you're prescribing is how it's going to feel. Some degree, you're not a fighter on the athlete's system when they are going out and performing. So we're looking at, when you look at like speed reserve, and we look at just training the athlete as a whole, when you hear sprint coaches say this, like, if you want to get someone better at 400-meter runner, get them to run 200 meters faster. Because if they can run 200 meters faster, they're going to run the first 200 at sub-maximal effort and then be able to hold on to the last 200. But if they can't actually, run 200 meters at a certain pace, they're never going to get a PB in the 400 because they can't achieve those speeds. Yeah. So it's kind of similar if you look at it from that context with just training the athlete as the athlete in combat sports. It's like improving the hardware or the power reserve of these athletes, so then when they are fatigued in the later rounds, they can still pack a punch, or they can still defend a takedown, and they still have something to draw upon when they have fatigue. So this is where it comes down to, when you're actually designing training, the general thing we see is GPP, SPP, fucking SDE, special developmental exercises. When you work with a combat sport athlete, you have 2 days a week maximum.
Right.
Foundational movements, squatting, hinging, pulling, pushing. You're spending most of your time working on those basic principles in the weight room in order to just keep the athlete healthy. Trying to get specific and teaching them how to do, power cleans specific to the time demands or the force velocity demands of the sport. It's very hard to do with minimal time and injury. and
Right.
fatigue. So
Right.
we need to look at other methods and other ways to do that. And this is where it comes down to, okay, well, how can we do it with a loaded jump? How can we do it with, getting them to do Olympic lifting derivatives? What other tools do we have? And it's all limited by your imagination. Now, if you can't measure that online, that's when it becomes a bit of a whirlwind of knowing what to prescribe when you can't measure it online versus working with someone in person and you have data and you have your coaching eye to look at. So, sorry, I'm just going on a bit of a rant, but this is why I wanted to talk more about the middle ground,
Yes. Yeah.
because I think, do you think that the middle ground, you can make anything the middle ground if you move it.
Exactly.
If you
That's my
move,
biggest. That's my
you can
biggest
make
point.
anything a
Yes.
middle ground, and you can make anything either end of the spectrum of the force velocity curve. If it's heavy enough, if it's fast enough, if it's slow enough,
Probably a
if it's
lot easier for things to go slower, though. I always say this. It's a lot harder to make
of course,
anything you do in the weight room like sprinting, right? I'll just say that. But you can almost make anything milligram. Like one thing I like to always think about, one fun thought experiment is, could I get similar stimulus on my lower limb, like knee and hip strength, if I do some modification of a one-legged plyo where it is quite deep tier, where you are almost like crashing into it, stopping your whole momentum with one leg and then coming out of it. It's pretty brutal, and there are times where I literally just get buried. It's the same sort of thought process where you try to catch a heavy clean and you just get buried, right? It's the very similar sensations. For me personally, I do think actually it would be fun for you to try. So you just simply you can start from stationary and you just hop forward and then land on one leg and try to like yield deeply into it. Allow yourself to be accelerated downward by gravity and fight it and see whether you get buried or not. And if you do get buried, you can go back and look at what's the ground contact time, right? You can look back and see about the kind of joint angles you hit. That's the middle ground exercise, right? It has some amount of speed, it has a high amount of intent, and it's a modified version of a plyo where, again, shout out to like plus plyos guys, where plyos by themselves, I think, can cover the whole spectrum. So in that case, why view it from the perspective of, okay, I understand like why it's helpful, but why think about the need to hit every part of the curve when you can sort of see as what different kinds of stimulus does that provide? In that example I give, it gives you the stimulus is that how is the athlete able to handle fighting against momentum? Okay, how are you able to counter against momentum and then stop your loads that comes from speed rather than weight? Jump science talks about this quite a bit, where if you do a heavy back squat, the resistance comes mostly from the weight of the bar. But if you do a quick drop where you allow the bar to accelerate downwards, and you can do it with way lighter weight, but then the forces on your body comes from the speed of the bar. And to tie it back to physics, mass times velocity is momentum, and momentum is what your body has to fight against. So if mass is greater or speed is greater, the loads on your body ends up being greater. So you can use plyos to reach loads that you need to take a lot of time to fight against. You need to take a lot of time to generate the force to fight against by manipulating speed. You can easily do that. And that becomes the middle ground, or in a case where you literally collapse, you have to argue that's towards the higher force and slower speed end of the spectrum, right? If you get collapsed by your own literal momentum going downwards, you cannot argue that's in the middle of the curve anymore, even though it's just your body weight.
Yeah.
And it's just it's a version of a plyometric.
Well, it's from a rehab perspective, I'm always like, well, from what we know is that plyometrics bridge a gap between rehab and sports. Like that is the bridging gap between the two. And it's not to say that, you can't go out and move submaximal weights at high velocity and, work on power output and stuff like that. But I think using this kind of tool with, or just surfing the curve with combat sport athletes, I don't want to surf it for the sake of it. I want to surf it.
Exactly.
I want to surf it to elicit a specific adaptation. So I'm not wasting
Yes.
time. I'm not wasting time. I'm not creating a larger cost to the system just for the sake of nothing. I want to make sure that what I'm doing is having a positive effect. Now,
I want to
most
say
of,
this. There's one point I do want to add.
yeah,
Um, Sometimes that like people will say we want to serve the middle of the curve because power output is the greatest, right? That's one argument people will make, and there's been a good amount of pushback on it, and I just sort of want to reiterate the points and explain a little bit
please
what it
do.
is. So power output, it in general conversation, it has a very specific meaning and tone. But like I mentioned before, where work has a specific meaning in physics, the same is the case for power, where power is like the rate of energy transfer, energy generation. So work is equivalent to energy, meaning potential energy, kinetic energy, all of that. And power is how work is being. Okay, so the equation for power is work divided by time. So meaning it's a rate of change of work in some sense. And that's also the same, it's the equivalent to a product of force and velocity. So whenever you have pretty high force and pretty high velocity, power is going to be high because that's how mass works out, right? But just because power is high, it doesn't mean the stimulus is high.
Mm. So
So even though
elaborate.
some exercises have high power, it
Yeah,
might not be the most stimulating, which
yeah,
ties back to what we were saying before.
yeah. So that's like looking at peak power as a sole metric. Um, like if you have a longer time to accelerate an object, which is you have a higher impulse, um,
Uh-huh.
then you're going to have a higher peak power reading. And this is stuff I've spoke about with Ralph. What we're looking at is the rate of force, like the rate at which you apply force or the time to peak velocity. Um,
Uh-huh. Which
you
is
know,
like peak acceleration. It's tied to how quickly you can accelerate, right? Which is almost the goal. It pretty much is the goal for the training and the movements.
yeah, and this is where if you're looking at moving sub-maximal loads, but it depends on what metrics you're measuring. So if we're looking at peak power as a sole resource, like if you look at boxing science, I'm going to call it out, right? I put this
Sure.
post up where they were using a landmine punch. I think they had is it a gym master? I forgot what it's called.
Oh,
The
like
one,
to get the bar velocity?
yeah, got the bar velocity with the string. I forgot the
Sure.
brand of Gymaware. Gymaware, is that the one?
Yeah,
Yeah,
Jim
Gymaware.
away.
They had a Gymaware attached to it. And they were having athletes throw or either do a loaded variation and then they were doing one with just unweighted. And they were
Sure.
seeing if athletes were more muscular driven or more elastic driven. That's basically what they were saying. And they
Sure.
were saying that if someone can accelerate a loaded barbell, relatively fast, then they struggle with doing with an empty load, then they need to do more elastic stuff. And it was just like jargon. But then when you look at the actual movement and the test, and he was using this to validate hand velocity. But if you look at the
Mm.
way the guy's throwing the landmine, it's his freaking lower body. Like it's his ability to kind of push into the floor, rotate his hips, rotate his spine, and then the arm is just that distal structure of accelerating that barbell. Um, I wouldn't even be looking at hand velocity. I would probably be looking at the joint segments before that, as we spoke about, and working on those qualities in the weight room and kind of let hand velocity take care of itself by just doing the sport and getting better at the sport. Like using the hardware, your time in the gym to work on the
The
hardware
hardware.
of the
Yes.
ground contact times, the hip and spine rotation, intermuscular coordination, the neural adaptations that you get from moving submaximal weights fast and jumping and all of that stuff that comes with just building the hardware. Hand velocity, or using the landmine punch as a tool to look at hand velocity. Let's say someone dips too low. Now, this is where, let's say someone dips lower than someone else. Let's say someone has a longer arm. would that affect the peak velocity? If he's only looking at peak velocity, which is a shitty metric to look at when you're looking at hand velocity, what do you think is missing here? If you've got many variables, would limb length would affect peak velocity, longer time to accelerate the bar? If they dip too long, would that have an effect on, if they dip deeper than someone else, would that have an effect on the peak power of the barbell? What do you
Okay.
think would be missing in that aspect?
No, this is amazing. There's like two branching things I want to talk on. So number one was it's actually done quite a lot in the sports research field. So boxing science might just be like, following from what was published. So I'll sort of
I've seen the studies.
yeah, so I'll
I
sort of
looked into
explain
it.
why. And I'll explain a bit the limitations for those kind of research, okay? So it's essentially trying to relate one exercise and like an output within the exercise with an output that's a lot closer to the actual sport itself. So the very similar analogy in jumping is like, weighted jumps with a barbell versus how high you jump from a free like running jump, right? Two seemingly similar exercises that you're thinking, oh, surely doing this exercise will help with performance. That is the rationale. And then you want to do an analysis, right, based on your data. And some of the limitations for that is, what are you really measuring in the two exercises? Are you just measuring how well an athlete is expressing their athleticism in two very different contexts? Meaning you're generating in the example of the squat jump versus running jump, are you just generally very, very strong and powerful? So hence you're able to reach really high readings for both? Or does the movement somehow performed in those two exercises complement each other or are closely related? Because we can say, I can say quite confidently that how you move in a weighted jump is quite different from how you do for a running jump. The same way you might say the way the barbell with the landmine is being done is so different from punching, where it might simply be measuring just how athletic someone is. If they're just a freak of nature, you're going to have high landmine velocity and high hand speed. Mm-hmm. If it's less so, then it might be lower, right? And then you're going to say, wow, there is a relationship where the faster landmine, the faster hand speed. And then you make an argument that it directly improves it when it's not what you really see. That's one issue with this kind of analysis, where if the movements are being performed using very different strategies, then the relationship you draw, it cannot be used to validate, hence this movement is good for developing hand speed, right? Even though people with faster hand speed may generally be able to accelerate a landmine better, it doesn't mean if you get better at accelerating landmines, you're going to have a better hand speed. These are very different lines of thoughts, but it can easily be colluded into one another. So that's like the first thought that came to me when you were describing, try to use one exercise to validate a performance measure. We can touch on this point before I go to the peak one.
It's just like, all right, so looking at the kinematics of a rear hand punch, which is the way they're throwing a landmine, you would look at that and go, oh yeah, look, it looks kind of specific to a punch.
Unless you look
he's
deeper.
He's got a gym aware attack, but it's not specific to a punch. It's not the problem of the exercise. I have no issue using a landmine throw.
Exactly. It's never the exercise.
No, yes. There's nothing wrong with a landmine throw. I think throwing a barbell as freaking hard as you can and letting it go at the end of it is fantastic, right?
It's like a mad ball throw, right?
But it's a fantastic way to coordinate your joints, like from the ground up. And the arc of the bar gives you something to push against. It kind of feels more natural. It feels good on the body to be able to move with a landmine.
It's the exact same arguments for power cleans, actually.
Yeah.
It doesn't mean it's a bad exercises, but the rationale that's what's
of why,
questionable.
yeah, of why he's determining this to be a valid marker and test for hand velocity. It's the metrics that he's looking at and the exact tool that he's using to validate his reasoning behind his prescription. That's what I have a
Yeah,
problem with. And
exactly.
that's something that, I mean, I work with MMA fighters, boxers, kickboxers, all of them, right? If you look at a thrower, for example, I know throwing is different to punching, but
Yeah,
if you look at throwing, you pretty much want to take care of what happens before the arm is the last distal structure, because the acceleration from those lower limbs or from everything else from those joint actions that take place before the hand is released has an
correct.
effect on how fast that hand moves.
Yes.
Now, if your feet are connected to the floor, which they are in boxing, and you know that you have to push and into the environment below your feet, and you have to push into the ground, and that ground then pushes back into the body, and then there's a certain, obviously, creates a ground reaction force, and then there's a certain sequence of joint actions that take place in order before that arm moves. I just think that you're basically just you're missing the freaking forest for the trees, right? I don't know if it's correct
Right.
saying, but you should be just focusing on building the horsepower from the ground up, because
In a
that
general sense,
yeah,
where
in a general
it can be
sense,
done in a variety of contexts, right?
yeah. But this is where it gets tricky, and where I think he's using it as well is he's looking at how well can they. If you're looking at a lamb, you are looking at it from a distal structure. You're measuring the velocity of the barbell, or the peak velocity of the barbell, peak power, sorry. And then if you, obviously, if the athlete has to throw that barbell, they're going to use a certain strategy in order to achieve that. And
Exactly.
does that strategy, is that strategy specific to throwing a punch?
Almost certainly not.
That's
And throwing a punch, the strategy, the best strategy to throw a punch happens when you throw a punch, right?
But what if you were to throw a med ball, right? Even though we're not trying to replicate the exact sporting movements, because you can't, because there's a whole
Yeah,
tactical element,
right.
there's a psychological element that you're not going to get in the weight room that you do when you're hitting pads, even, or when you're hitting a bag. It's different. It's a different. An athlete walks into a fight gym, automatically they're going to feel different than walking into a weight room. So
Exactly.
there's a big
Yes.
psychological difference there. When you That's just the least to say in that aspect of using that. So if we're looking at tests to use to validate how an athlete coordinates their joints, and you know, if we're looking at, let's say, because we don't have the technology to measure angular velocity effectively, most people don't. If we had an athlete, why not just get an athlete to throw a med ball as far as possible and use two different weights, one that's 7 kilos, one that's 2 kilos, and use it relative to their body weight or something. Pick a
And
weight.
then you can, and the one thing I will add is you can quite easily ask for some video of how they throw a punch, right? If you want to see how similarly the movements match, you can easily ask for a video or just ask for a demo, right?
Well, that's what I'm saying. Then it comes to a point. It's like, well, why not just train this guy to rotate like an animal and be able to apply force into the ground like a beast, and then let the skill of him doing the sport kind of
Mm-hmm.
kind of integrate the hardware and software together,
Yeah.
because you're not going to really be able to replicate that in that scenario with boxing. Now, you have coaches that will use an integration of getting a fighter to integrate a sport specific, well, integrate the sport. Let's say they'll throw a landmine and then throw a hook after it, where they're using reactivity off a ball. My issue is that that's all well and good, but could you be utilizing your time better to improve the horsepower of this athlete?
I'll say this. It's actually very similar to the arguments people make against weighted implements that's like, for example, weighted baseball. right? Or similar things like wearing a vest while you sprint or wearing a vest while you jump. And it might, I actually, the thought of it has changed a bit over the years, but it might be another case of doing the right thing for the wrong reasons. So here's what I mean. Using slightly different variations or like slightly different implements in the baseball example, it can actually be valuable in terms of skill acquisition. You are adding some constraints. You're slightly modifying the task of interest.
Is this
to get
Rob Gray's?
exactly to provide a spectrum of to provide a variety of exposure, right?
Constraints
To
based
similar
learning.
versions of the movements for benefits of skill acquisition and motor learning. Now, just because it's good for that doesn't mean you should be chasing the outputs in it, because you need to realize that when you modify these things, it in itself becomes a constraint. It's a constrained version of the sport-specific task. So
Well,
in that case, output's certainly going to be lower,
like
almost always.
let's look at a resisted sprint for acceleration,
Right.
right? I mean, if you were to resist the way someone punches, like, would that, what if you put bands around someone's arms, right?
Right.
And you got them punching? I don't know. I don't
It
know.
could be
It
no,
could.
it might not be. It could be useful for learning if you're seeing that the person, because if you think in that specific example, which I know might not be what people, okay, it might very well be what people do, but if you're saying, wow, the person, the boxer I'm working with is really not finishing the punch, right? The acceleration at the end is really suboptimal. From a skill acquisition perspective, you can argue that having a resistance that increases linearly as you go further into the punch, that could be helpful for a motor learning perspective. But I would never in 1,000 years argue it's great for developing peak hand velocity or peak output, right? That's the thing where it could be good for one aspect, for one set of reasons, but not great for another reason. You shouldn't use the rationale that you haven't validated to say doing this was going to definitively improve your hand velocity, your absolute outputs. But it could be helpful for skill acquisition. So I want to be fair on that front.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm just looking at tests that, for example, like, yes, you're just looking at raw power output when you are throwing that landmine. But if you had a better test where not every punch is thrown the same way, and if you looked at the reactive ability, what if a fighter steps back and then redirects that force in a linear and rotational aspect where they're moving backwards and forwards really fast? There's a number of things you could do with a med ball. And there's a number of things that you could measure that would just be more valid tests and more realistic. But then again, you're still not measuring the hand velocity. You're measuring the reactive ability of the lower limbs to be able to coordinate and put force into the ground and to be able to rotate the axle skeleton. And then that hand or the distance of that ball following through is a representation of what's happened before the hand is released. Unless you slip, the ball slips out of your hand somehow.
Okay, so what's just to add more layers of complexity, because that's how reality often is. It might actually require the lower limbs to do more than they would have in the actual punching task, where
you're exceeding the demands.
Correct, in some capacity, but no, it's not like you have when you added a picture. It's not like a perfect stretch where, oh, your hand does 10% more and your legs does 10% more. It can very easily be like a sideways stretch where when you go from a punch to a mat ball, your legs are just doing more and your arms are doing the same exact thing, right? This could easily happen when you use tests. So you have to be aware, by looking at, again, the task itself and how the athlete's performing it. Are you actually measuring, a greater contribution of the lower limbs, but similar contribution of the upper limbs? or is it a proportional increase of contributions of both limbs? In that case, that's like the perfect scenario, right? Where you can more confidently say this is closer to what will happen in a real scenario. Then
Correct.
versus, oh, your legs are just doing 20% more now because you have a mat ball, as opposed to just your hands.
Yeah. And that's where I think we're missing the boat on it. It's the same with wrestling. I mean, there's a lot less research on wrestling and what forces and velocities they're moving at in certain movement tasks. But if you look at like a wrestler doing resisted, like there's a lot of it's acceleration. Like they take no more than 8 steps moving forward in a match, and they can put some decent acceleration into the ground. These wrestlers, but you look at them doing resisted penetration steps with bands, where they drop their center of mass and then they direct their force forward. And they're rolling over the knee. So the acceleration stops as soon as the knee hits the floor. So when their knee hits the floor and they roll over that foot, they either make contact with their opponent and they have to either redirect the force, or the velocity goes a different way. It's not a smooth transition like this. It'll be like down
Yep.
and then, whatever reacts with the opponent if they sprawl and whatever happens, right? It's just interesting to see that, like from a biomechanical standpoint and looking at combat sports as a form to measure, what are the time to peak velocities in certain aspects and what's happening, what forces are being placed upon the body in order to be able to execute the task. There's not much research out there because I think the tactical element of the sport is a big piece here. And I think if you were to measure these variables, like within certain movements that wrestlers take part in, or do, they're going to execute it differently every time. It's going to be
It's hard to measure. It's more so a logistics issue, right? I think you're able to measure forces on the soft surfaces, but it's a lot harder to do. Like it needs to be validated a lot more because like when you're working on a wrestling mat, the mat might have a little bit of give that cannot be easily captured by the force plates, right? That's when you sort of the easiest way would be to look at, how the athlete's center mass is moving through space. That gives you some idea of the direction of forces, like you said, when obviously when you drop under, the goal is to get lower to the ground, and then as you rush forward, right? And if you don't apply force onto your opponents to stop your velocity, you have to do it some other way. Like these are, again, the principles is the same. It's just the reality of the research. It makes it difficult, for sure. But you can gain a lot just by looking at the side of the equation, which is the motion side, the center mass movement side.
So what's in store for you now, Sam? Like, what are you focusing on now? Just with your research and your business and basketball, is there anything you're working on?
So right now I am trying to wrap up my papers. So I have, so what I've done so far is I have 2 baseball papers, one that's still in review, and it's actually one looking at how pitching is done from a fundamental physics perspective. The other one's looking at what things relate to performance from like in terms of momentum of the whole body and momentum of the body segments. And then I have basketball papers that one's already done where it looks at, again, how is momentum controlled. And the second one is looking at what's different when you jump with and without the basketball. So these ones, 2 of them is already published, 2 of them is in review. And I'm working on probably 1 more paper, maybe 2, but most likely 1, where it's just looking at the age-old questions of what things are good for jump height in basketball. And the approach we're taking here is we're looking at specific technical elements that occurs within the 2-foot running jump and seeing, which ones are contributing more to jump height in, subgroups of people. Because one thing that previous research has done a lot, and it's the simpler analysis, is just looking at everyone as the single data point. And then you're seeing, what things relate to jump heights. But like coaches, especially in recent years, okay, in like the past 10 years, it's like saying different people move differently. There's different groups of movers, be it, the common, elastic, forceful, all of that. There's different specific things that make sense for different people. And we are using a specific statistical analysis procedure to account for that. We are looking at, as a group, here's the trends, but also within each person, what are the trends? So this is something that we are actively looking at, and that will probably be the last paper of my dissertation.
Yep.
And at the same time, just looking for different kinds of jobs. So some things with working with the NBA teams, processing their reports, that would be great.
That's
if,
awesome.
if you have any following NBA teams that you're following, maybe
I'm not sure.
maybe they'll see this.
I'm not sure.
Maybe the bad boys of the 80s era Detroit that just gets the elbow going.
Yeah.
But yeah, looking for jobs, enjoy teaching. So I'm also looking at some of those and see where it takes me.
That's awesome, man. That's interesting. All right. Well, mate, thank you for jumping on, and
of course,
hopefully, hopefully I get this wrapped up. I need someone who can edit this thing up for me, and I'll have it up on YouTube and Spotify.
Yeah, sounds awesome. It's great talking to you.
Likewise.